You know, the mind has strange features, according to John Leaf. It has these, and he's a neurologist. And so does the tiny world of atoms. You see, there's these strange things that meet. And mind can instantly link to almost an infinite number of different associations. It can conceptualize the size of the universe at one moment. A second later, it hears someone calling. Then a moment later, empathizes with political unrest thousands of miles away. And the next instant, it contemplates photons, emotional states, memories, physical sensations, the environment, and a sense of long-range purpose simultaneously influence the mind. Today we're going to address once again the issue of free will and choice. It's a question of how we choose. Do we have a choice, or is it all just a complex game of billiards of everything determined as consequences of what has come before? Wow. You know, this is the article or the question that is one of the biggies. What Jennifer Doudna, who came up with the CRISPR gene, calls one of the grand questions. How do we address free will? Is it really there, or is it really like that, you know, just the deterministic universe where everything's coming into play? Now, I'll admit, and this is part of my own biases, one of my pet peeves is when people say everything happens for a reason. No, everything is happening in all directions, sometimes randomly, sometimes if we can trace the roots of it, but it's not a reason. We apply the reason. That's an overlay we put on it, and our whole overlay is itself insufficient to really reflect being in accord with the wholeness of it, because reason is intellectual, it's rational, and we have to start seeing that maybe there's some other pieces. There are many neurologists who talk about our neural circuitry and that free will looks to them like an illusion. Yet still choice happens, even though it's influenced by outside forces. And we can go into genetics and environment. We can go into the unconscious and how, if you can look at the unconscious, we're now seeing that your brain decides to do something before you are consciously aware you've decided it. So maybe this billiard ball thing is what it is. But wait. Trillions of times, every minute, your brain is making these interconnections that are literally 1 to 3 nanometers. Now, that smallness means that there is a small opening to what is called quantum tunneling. These are an infinite number of possibilities that are existing in the atoms in our brain that are coming into us in ways that we don't know. But what it is if you look at what a quantum tunneling is, it's a wave function that can propagate through barriers. And sometimes it can't just propagate through the barrier, but it can be on both sides of the barrier at the same time. I mean, what the heck? So you see, there are these unseen forces that are happening and are offering the brain infinite possibilities for volition and free will that maybe we're not aware of, and that are hugely important for our understanding of conscious forward volition. Now, does that exist or not? That's what we're going to talk about today, because it seems sometimes when I look at my own volition and the decisions that I've made and the choices I've made, it feels sometimes like the very language I use to frame the question of choice invalidates my ability to even talk about choice or not. So I end up face to face with the mystery once again, over and over. Free will and choice. Mary Ann, we've been on this free will and choice train since I think the second coffee we had together. What say you? Are we choosing to be here, or are we just, the conscious point of the billiard ball?
Well,
And I'm not asking you to make a choice. I'm just asking you to reflect on the mystery of that, because I don't think any of us are going to be able to choose.
Well, we did make a choice to have that second cup of coffee, and then that led to where we are right now in this moment. So my belief I have pondered this for so many years, and the idea that the choices that I make, for me, they feel like an illusion, because I can agonize over a decision, and you write down the pros and you write down the cons, and you have all of these little mechanisms to try and figure out what to do next, right? But those pros and those cons are based on what you know and what you've been exposed to and what your experience is, what you've read, what you've learned, the people that have come in and out of your life. And so all of those things come together as you are trying to make a choice. But I think that ultimately it all boils down to responsibility. And some of us want to abdicate our responsibility. We want to be told what to do and not take the responsibility for the choice that we are making. And so even if that choice can only be the choice that we made, because of all of those influence, we are still responsible for it. It is still ours, and we are still filtering all of that minutia of our lives in order to bring it together. And you're talking about that quantum
tunneling.
That goes over my head a little bit, but I kind of get that there are so many different possibilities, and yet there is only one choice that you're going to make. So
Amen.
That's kind of where I go.
Okay. Bob, how about you?
Well, fortunately, I have the answer to the question. We've only been pondering it for some 300,000 years, probably. No, it's you can't be a scientist or believe in science without the idea that you're looking for first causes. And that's sort of the basis for science. So in one sense, science denies free will. Certainly B.F. Skinner, one of the most influential psychologists in the middle of last century, he believed that everything we do was predetermined by our experiences, specifically how we were rewarded and punished and so forth. But the more we've looked at things, the more we begin to see that we can describe free will as an emergent quality. It's something that we can only have the question of whether there's a free will if we have the idea of self-awareness. An animal who is reacting to the world does not wonder whether or not their reaction is their choice or not. They're just reacting. And it's only when you can begin to look at yourself reacting that you even can question whether there is such a thing as free will. And I think that last week we were talking about feelings and how feelings influence our behavior. Well, the idea that we have free will is really an internal feeling that we have control over our choices. And whether or not it's real or not is almost immaterial. Because if we believe we have a choice, then we have a moral responsibility to make the correct choice.
And that's where I want to pick up right there. Because if we do not at least have a pretense of free will, then we are unable to hold each other accountable. And this is, you can't claim personal autonomy and freedom and not be accountable for that. And so I think your point, Bob, in the end, it doesn't really matter because there's a dance going on here, and it's once again a mystery dance. It's a dance between forces that move us and how we move forces. And both can be said to be true, and one does not undo the other. It's not either or, but both and. And Marianne, you've brought this up over and over again, that we each do have an influence. It's important to find our own peace, to find our deepest level of accord in order to bring that to the world. And that affects the world in a way that may seem very small, but it compounds itself. I'm in a debate about profanity on the Beatles group on Facebook, and I am having so much fun because people want to turn the Beatles into this very sweet, nice music thing. And, I did my thesis on rock and roll. My thesis was called "Excuse Me While I Kiss the Sky." My professors hated it, but they couldn't argue against it. And my whole point is there's a cultural revolution going on, and we are part of it, and we are each adding a piece. And it is not a sweet, nice thing. It is a place where the sacred and the profane are dancing, where free will and determinism are struggling with each other like Israel, which means to wrestle with God. You see, this is the point of the mystery. This is one of the places where we meet the mystery face on, and we can dance with her if we dare to be honest with the argument. And both of you have presented points of view that totally put us at the vortex of the mystery, because we can never be sure, and yet being sure is not what matters. So what say you on that, Marianne? I just kind of went off on a couple tangents.
Well, and honestly, they're all great tangents. And, the fascinating thing about being a human being, and Bob, I loved what you indicated with this free will, that it's something we attain. It's not something we have. It's something we grow into. And you can only do that when you start to recognize that we have the capacity to observe our own lives and not just participate, but also to watch what's going on. And as we start to watch it, we create narratives, and we create a whole internal world. And then we make choices and we make decisions that affect the external world, which then turns around and affects our internal world. And so and I think you pointed this out earlier, Red Hawk, and it is this dance. It's this constant coming, giving and taking, and just trying to figure out, what am I responsible for? And the only thing that I feel like, there have been so many external things that happened in my life that I had absolutely no control over. And there were times when I felt like I'm just going to ride the tide. I'm just going to get on the raft and float and figure out where I end up, and not take an act of participation. And yet at the same time, I knew that I could choose how I respond to whatever was happening. That was where my choice came in. It wasn't whether or not this was going to happen. It was, how do I choose to respond to it? How do I take these experiences and turn them into how I want to live my life? And so I think we're all dealing with this, and I know that this is kind of cliche, but going back to that whole serenity prayer, and there is wisdom in there. What can I control and what can I not control? And then taking absolutely 100% responsibility for what I can control, and living with that. Yeah,
and what you're talking about relates back to this emergent quality. And it really has to do, this is so linked to all our conversations, but they all are, is becoming conscious, becoming aware. Whether it's, as we begin to see, I keep reacting that way, why? And then you pull on the thread and you get back to your family of origin. And you all of a sudden debrief your own life and the forces that are moving you and controlling you. This is what good therapy does. It helps you identify these internal forces so that you no longer are subject to their control. And that's becoming conscious, becoming aware. And that's what the deep end is about. I mean, I don't know about, well, I do know about our whole, the three of us, we're all walking around scratching our heads, becoming more aware every week, because we're scratching our heads about the right things. We're scratching our heads where the place where the rubber meets the road, and we have to bring the forbearance of our past, of the truth of our existence, of the threads of meaning that have brought us to that moment, so that our decisions might become more informed and more conscious. And I think that that's part of, when you said emergent quality, what entered my mind is everybody is not everybody has the same amount of free will. Some people have a will that's freer. I don't know how else to say that they can escape the forces of the past because they've already flipped the bird at them in one real respect.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned therapy, and really the idea of free will is really the foundation of therapy. And what a therapist will tell you is, if you want to change yourself, you can, but you have to make the choice to make that change. And then you go into pulling the threads and seeing what events have shaped the way you think and so forth. But if you don't believe that there is the possibility of making that choice, then therapy will never work for you. So again, it may be a fiction, it may be an illusion, but if you buy into it, it can change your life. And like you say, we're always dancing and asking these questions of ourselves and of others around us. Many of the others don't want us to ask those questions, but that's a different story. But the more we examine ourselves, and this is not a new thing. I mean, go back to Socrates, go back to Lao Tzu, go back to any enlightened person, and I use that in the broadest sense of the term enlightenment. Any enlightened person knows that they have to look at themselves first and foremost, because that's where the whole thing is happening.
And it keeps coming back.
I think that's...
Go ahead, Mary Ann, I'm sorry.
Well, that's okay. Go ahead.
No, you go.
Well, I was going to say, and that kind of goes back to that whole idea of the internal versus the external. Are you who you are because of what happened to you in your life, or are you who you are because of who you choose to be and how you want to operate? And you can't get to that second place without that internal investigation, without understanding what those things were that brought you here and how you reacted or didn't react, and then understanding that you could have made a different choice, possibly, but you didn't. And so what do you do now? And that's where that whole idea of choice kind of kicks in.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, now I can choose.
And now you've brought another piece that I mentioned earlier, which is our very language of internal, external. I quit thinking in those terms, at least that's part of my own discipline, because shamans in an animistic stage saw inside and outside as a spectrum in which the self flows. And there's not this distinction between in and out, because the gates were all open when you were, before we settled and created civilization, and you had to have that flow, that the external was what was internal and vice versa. Another thing I want to address is something you said, Bob, and that's the illusion. Remember, in Vedic thought, it was the reality, Maya, is an illusion. By the time you get to the Gita, you realize, okay, it's an illusion, but here we are inside the illusion, so what are we going to do with it? And that's where Arjuna comes and learns to fight the battles of his life based on his dharma. And is that your predetermined nature? Well, your genetics and environment do have a big say in that, and then you have a say of what you do within the context of that, and how some people actually have to, I know when my son was going through all kinds of crap and against us, calling us all kinds of names, I had to take the door off of his bedroom because he kept slamming it, and I put up a sheet and said, "Slam that sucker." And I asked a therapist what's going on, and she said, "Redhawk, you and Edie are very big personalities. How much energy is it going to take Josh to separate himself from you?" And I went, "Whoa, okay." See, that's what part of adolescence is. It's a separation, and it's where we become allegedly an autonomous being, no longer under the control of those things, and fully free to explore those forces that we are under the control of, that we might demythologize them, disempower them, and move on with a life that is true and free. Now, why do I say that? Well, it's my dharma. I say that, and I meet with you too, and we do this podcast because dharma is what is truth and what is a path. And my true path is to ask these questions, is to have more thoughts in my head than I can handle, and to try to address every one of them all the time. I'm also a good neurotic, so it all works out very, very well. Choice, we grow into it. We must become fully human beings in order to do that. And that's, Marianne, when I hear you talk, that's what I keep hearing. We each must reach for wholeness and health within ourselves, and then reflect it into the world. And using that health and wholeness as a metric for those forces that control us. Because there's some forces, let's face it, I want to be controlled by. Love, forgiveness, joy, hope. Those are all forces.
Well, you left us speechless, Redhawk, because it's like, absolutely, we do. I don't know. I kind of, I still go back to, and I love what you said about the internal and the external kind of flowing in and out of each other, and they do. It is this dance. There is this thing that happens, but I think also that unless we attend to our own thoughts and we attend to our own conditioning, that we're not going to be able to be aware that we do have a free choice. Sometimes we start to think that this is just the way things are, and this is the way I am, and I am going to just not even try to figure this out.
Or would you say the devil made me do it?
Exactly, right? Yes. Well, and it's kind of having that, the idea that we all secretly want a dictator, a benevolent dictator over our lives, so that we don't have to take responsibility, so that when something goes wrong, we can blame it. Oh, the devil made me do it. Or instead of saying, okay, I did this, this is what happened, I have to accept those consequences, and now my choice is, what do I do with that? Some people will live in guilt and they'll beat themselves up for years and years and years. Some people will say, okay, I learned a lesson and I'm going to take that and move on from there. Some people will continue in the same pattern because they won't acknowledge that it was actually their actions and their choice. And so I think there's this whole spectrum, and I liked that you used that word, I think earlier. There's this whole spectrum of the
Marianne just froze up.
We act.
Say that again, Marianne, because you're freezing up.
And react in the world. Well, and I keep getting a thing popping up that's saying my internet connection is unstable, so I apologize. So it's this idea of the spectrum of everything moving in and out.
Yeah.
I think that's
And I've used the term vortex of wonderment as that place between the two, and that's where each of us really lives, at that place, and hopefully it is just flying you into wonder in all directions. I want that for everybody. I think, if I had a religion, it would be called wonder. Go ahead, Bob. I think I cut you off.
No. I was just going to say that these choices never end, and they always occur in the moment. They always occur right now, where you are. And the past is going to have an influence. Your aspirations and hopes for the future are going to have an influence. But those choices you make are happening right in the moment. And I think that it's important to get back to the idea of accepting the responsibility for your choices, because that's what I think a lot of people don't get to that point. They're not self-aware. They're not analyzing themselves enough to take those responsibilities.
Yeah. And that's the growing place.
Yeah. We talked, I don't know, last week I used the saying, the road to hell is paved by good intentions. People make the choice to be good without understanding what that really means. They've got an idea and they haven't analyzed it enough. They haven't looked far enough into the implications of their choice. They just make it because it makes them feel good.
Yeah.
And so it's a never-ending dance, and I think dance is just a wonderful metaphor for our lives and for the choices we have to make and for the questions we ask and for the mystery that surrounds us. We just got to keep this dance going and keep all of the different threads woven into some kind of a meaningful tapestry.
Amen. And speaking of meaningful tapestries, we're at the end of this one. So, Marianne, I don't mean to cut you off, Bob, but I'm cutting you off. Marianne, what's your final comments on this free will and choice thing?
Well, I think that Bob brought up a very good point about these choices happen in the moment. It doesn't matter how much planning down to that moment. And in that moment, if we are tired and hungry or we are having difficulties, our choice is going to be very different than if we are feeling loved and we are happy. And so when those choices happen and they may have negative consequences, taking responsibility, I agree, is paramount. And the more that we can keep ourselves in a loving state, then the more our choices will reflect that. And I think that whole idea of you make that choice now and then it solidifies. I liked your idea of, or your talk about the wave and the particle. Once you make that choice, it becomes solidified in your history, and then everything kind of goes from there. So again, it goes back to let's work on ourselves, and then we can go out there in the world and make our choices.
There you go. Bob, final comments?
Well, I think I've pretty much said everything that's on my mind at this point.
I can't believe that for a minute.
I don't know. It just seems like we're always going around the same circle, and
well, we are. We're hoping it's a widening gyre that moves higher, but it is a circle.
Hopefully, there's others joining us.
Well, it's a spiral that's coming down into
But I think that the idea of choice and responsibility has to constantly be together, because if you only make choices without the idea that you have any responsibility for the outcomes of those choices, then you're really not making your own choices. You're just going along with the flow, if you will. But it's the idea of taking that responsibility and stepping forward and making your next choice based upon what happened in response to your last choice, and not just keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again.
Yeah. And the whole concept of how we learn what is responsible and what is not, to me, has just been a trip in the real sense of the word. And as I look at the world, and I've talked about spirituality being now, and religion comes from the root religare, which means to relink. It links this now to the now I had a few minutes ago. That's religion. So when we look at, the great world religions, what we're really talking about are these threads, these bridges that bridge us to certain types of meanings that tell us you're in accord here. You're being responsible. You are accounting for yourself in the great accord of oneness. Religion, religare. I want to talk about religion being threads of meanings, and to not see them as against each other, but to see them as different threads that can be woven in to a human soul in such a way that they all are part of the oneness of being, and that they all speak a little bit different perspective, that we might have the fullness of our being, and that what is emerging now, this emergent quality of free will and consciousness, well, my friends, the religion of wonder is upon us. May the oneness of being be with you until our next podcast. We've ended the podcast, but I want to say something, and that's to invite some of our listeners to write us. We've got listeners in countries all over the world, all over the United States, and we're trying to bring some of those together. Write me at redhawkthedeepend@gmail.com. That's redhawkthedeepend@gmail.com, and just say, hey, we're here, we're listening, WTF, and we'll be right with you. Thanks and blessings.